Hello, welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This morning, well, this afternoon, depending where you are, we'll be discussing the book All the Rage. Full title is All the Rage, Reasserting Radical Lesbian Feminism. This is edited by Lynne Harne and Elaine Miller and discussed this morning or afternoon, depending where you are, by Julia Long, Elaine Hutton, and one of the editors, Lynne Harne. So I will turn it over to our wonderful, talented speakers.
Marion, before you do, can we get rid of the other speaker? Well, I can see the other two still here. Can you change them from panelists to audience, or is it not possible to do that? Usually Joe does that, because otherwise, can everyone see them still? It's a bit distracting.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe if Ebru, I don't know if you're able to do that, but maybe if someone could do that as we, because usually we only see the speakers and we can see the other names. So I think they just need to be changed from panelists to audience. Maybe if that can happen, but otherwise we'll just have to.
I've done that. It should be okay.
Yeah, I can see them.
Yeah, I can see the names.
We can still see them. But anyway, maybe if you can do that, Ebru, we'll continue. But I think it would be good if it's just the three of us on screen, because it's a little bit distracting. So anyway, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm really, really pleased to welcome Lynne Harne and Elaine Hutton today to discuss their fantastic book, All the Rage, Reasserting Radical Lesbian Feminism, which was published, I think, in 1996 originally, and now I'm delighted to be able to say is being republished by Spinifex, and we'll talk a bit more about. I think that's very, very significant and important that it's being republished at the moment, and we can talk about that sort of later on. So just to introduce our speakers, for those of you who may not be familiar with them. So Lynne Harne is a long-time lesbian feminist activist and writer who joined the women's liberation movement and became a lesbian feminist in the early 1970s. Later, she became a member of Angry Women, taking direct action against the newly created sex shops which sold violent pornography, and also against other targets. As a lesbian mother, she researched how lesbian mothers were losing custody of their children in the 1970s and early 1980s. And in 1985, worked at the Greater London Council as the challenging heterosexism officer. Quite a thing that there was such a role in those days. Yeah. At the beginning of the 1990s, she started teaching women's studies and joined the lesbian history group. She has a PhD on male power and violent fathers from the now notorious University of Bristol. By 2010, she once again became a radical lesbian feminist activist, campaigning against the queer and trans movements. She's a founder member of the Lesbian Rights Alliance and has worked with younger lesbians on creating the Positively Lesbian website, positivelylesbian.org, if you want to look that up. Elaine Hutton is a long-term feminist activist. She's been involved in campaigning for and setting up rape crisis centres in 2 UK cities, Newcastle upon Tyne in the late 1970s, and Bristol around 2009 to 2010. In the 1980s, she was a member of campaign groups such as Lesbians in Education, Women Against Violence Against Women, and she was also on the collective of Only Women Press. She worked at that time in a local women's centre, and from 1984 to 88, she worked for a young women's project in London, and she has a chapter where she talks about that in the Not Dead Yet collection from Spinifex, on what was termed girls' work. And later she worked for Buckinghamshire Youth Service, where she continued to promote the importance of work with young women. She was an out lesbian feminist and trade union negotiator, which caused difficulty in conservative Buckinghamshire. After All the Rage, she went on to edit a book on lesbian fiction and political ideology for the Women's Press, and we'll talk about that as we go. She is now an active member of the Lesbian History Group and the Lesbian Rights Alliance, and also involved in an education group working with parents challenging trans ideology in schools. Wow. And all the time I thought they just stayed at home and baked cakes. So they've obviously been really decades long contributions there. So really fantastic to have you both on to talk about this book. So I'll just begin by, for those who aren't familiar with it, just give a very brief overview, because I really want to hear what you two have to say about it. But this book, as I say, was originally published in the mid-1990s, and it documents and analyzes the backlash against lesbian feminism and radical feminism at that time. And I think one of the reasons it is so very relevant today is that it really it critiqued a lot of the things that weren't necessarily being perceived as a backlash from those within the sort of broader lesbian and gay movements, and are very much proved to be so. So things like queer theory, sadomasochism, lesbian chic, lipstick lesbianism, as it says in the description on the back of the book. These are all the rage in today's, the 1990s popular culture. But as the authors and editors of All the Rage, Reasserting Radical Lesbian Feminism show us, these glamorous trends are in fact the postmodern disguises of a patriarchal backlash against the socio-political achievements of the last 3 decades of radical lesbian feminism. I think that really gives a good overview of what the book's about. It's divided into 5 sections. The first section is on individualism, identity, and the conservatism of what was then the lesbian and gay movement. The second section is about lesbian sexuality and sexual practice. The third section is about representation of lesbians in the media and popular culture. The fourth is about lesbian feminism and as I put, academia. And the fifth section is looking at ways forward from all of that. So I hope that gives a sense and a flavour of what we're going to be talking about. But as we're not usually in the position of having the actual authors of the texts and the editors of the text here speaking about their work, so it's a great opportunity, Lynne, I thought, to begin by asking you what motivated you, and obviously it was yourself and Elaine Miller at the time, to put together this book. Why did you see a need for it?
Well, we were aware that a lot of younger lesbians were getting involved in imitating gay men and getting into sadomasochistic practices and so on, and that sort of came out of what had been happening at the Lesbian and Gay Centre right in about 1985, and it was sort of building up, other women were beginning to write, lesbian feminists and radical feminists were beginning to write about what was going on and how it was affecting the still existing radical lesbian feminist movement, although much more marginalized and so on. But one of the really triggers for me was going to this gay and lesbian festival in Hackney and seeing a stall with all these intercoloured plastic dildos that were being sold by these lesbians, and this just so incensed me, and I was so angry about it. I mean, I went up with them and just said, what do you think you're doing, and haven't you ever heard about the clitoris, and so on. And I literally had to be hauled away by my friend because I was I wanted to overturn their table, basically. And then one of the other things that had recently happened was a publication called Passions Between Women by Emma Donoghue, which actually split the lesbian history group for a time because some women thought they should have her to speak and others of us didn't. And it was really a pornographied history of lesbians from the 17th century, and it all based except for one very brief account on male accounts of lesbians and their pornographic fantasies about lesbians. And so it wasn't real lesbian history at all. And we were really angry about how that was being represented as lesbian history. So that was how we got into writing the book and getting articles from other women and so on. We thought it was also important to say that there were many lesbian feminists who were writing and objecting about it. It wasn't just a few of us. There were a lot of us who were doing that.
But and the fact that you brought these pieces together in a collection, which is obviously, there's, because I know there were, the various newsletters. I think Elaine might talk a bit about that later on, those kinds of the women's liberation publications. But I think it's so important that you brought it to brought some of those key critiques together in this collection. I just wondered, actually, a lot of women, particularly maybe not from your era and from the sort of London context, might be wondering, when you mentioned the lesbian and gay, London Lesbian and Gay Centre, could you maybe just say a little bit about what happened there, because I think women might be wondering what that's about.
Well, what happened there was that they wanted to, there were lesbians who wanted to have a lesbian and S&M group there, following what gay men were already doing. And it was objected to initially by one of the workers there, who is a lesbian feminist, and by lots of other women. But basically what happened was that they took a vote on it, and lots of lesbian feminists went. We were about 40% of the audience, but their audience was much bigger, with gay men there to support them. And basically this vote, they won the vote, and we lost it. So, and then LASM, Lesbian Action Against Sadomasochism, started, which was really a consequence of that, and campaigning against lesbian bars, which were and demonstrating outside lesbian bars, which were having S&M nights and that sort of thing. I mean, it was really becoming mainstream in lesbian bars. So that's the background to it, really.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things, and I think one of the things I think is so good about the book, and I know that does get discussed in the book in one of the chapters, that you can really, like, for me, it was very helpful as a kind of reminder as to what we're seeing now in terms of the attempts to erase or violate or basically destroy women-only spaces and lesbian spaces. You can really see all the kind of preceding things that have happened that have had a very parallel kind of effect, because obviously then at that point that centre became, it ceased to be to have any kind of be any kind of resource for lesbian feminists or anyone who didn't want to have this horrible kind of glorification of sexual violence.
It did. I mean, we just didn't use it. And there's one point when S&M tried to take over the last Lesbian Strength March and have it march to the centre. And that didn't happen. But that also destroyed lesbian strength marches as well, really.
And I think that's one of the things that the book does so well, is to document that. I mean, I think sometimes probably no one here or no one in the audience would have this impression, but I think sometimes women might have the impression that the backlash is always this kind of outside thing that like the obvious, the far right, or conservatives, or the Christians, whatever, that's what's perceived as the backlash. But what you document, I think, so really quite heartbreakingly, is the sort of the backlash right in the very heart of you know, what should have been a sort of liberatory movement. But anyway, I don't want to, sorry, I'm taking over a bit. Could you say something about, there's the really important chapter about identity politics that was written by Sandra McNeill, who is obviously still very active. And that, again, I think is something that really speaks to us today. So would you maybe say something about what she was talking about there?
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing that was happening internally. And I mean, what Sandra talks about, I mean, there were a lot of differences between lesbians and women in the women's liberation movement. Well, not just between lesbians, but between women in women's liberation. And women began to address this in their own groups, like there became black women's groups and working class women's groups and disabled women's groups and so on. And that, you know, Sandra's saying that was all good, but how it developed into identity politics is hard to explain, really, but it did. And what it meant was that women began to talk as and usually often more than one identity. Like if you're an Irish woman and you're also what was then called incest survivors, child sexual abuse survivors, that took you up the ladder, because what it did was create a huge hierarchy of oppression. And you couldn't, the other problem with it was that you couldn't actually disagree. You weren't allowed to disagree. When a woman said, I'm speaking out this, that, and so on, you weren't allowed to disagree if you, or to argue with what they were saying.
You were at the bottom of the hierarchy.
You just had to be silenced. Janice Raymond has referred to this as the sort of tyranny of tolerance. And if you did disagree, you were immediately, or tried to argue with what they were saying, you were immediately told you were racist, you know, classist, whatever.
I think like reading it and hearing you speak about it, I think it's kind of I mean, obviously the whole identity politics, it's like they've taken it and run with it, haven't they? I mean, now I think we can probably feel quite nostalgic for when women at least were talking about real oppressions rather than oppressions being non-binary or fluid, gender fluid or whatever. But I think I see exactly what you're saying, because obviously these oppressions are really important. That you know, no one's disputing the importance of you know, analysing racial oppression, the oppression of disabled people, you know, or the way in which people are disabled by the sort of norms of society. But the way it kind of gets ossified into these individual identities, and when you were saying that, which are then used to basically stifle any kind of analysis. I just think now it's got this form of check your privilege, hasn't it?
It's check your privilege.
It's the kind of.
Can I just say one thing? The other thing that happened was the Evening Standard used to steadily mock this the whole time. So they were always doing articles about a black one-legged lesbian mother. You know, they would sort of write articles mocking it. And I can also remember once shamefully taking advantage of it at a conference. I was really thirsty, and I was actually there was a very large queue to the drinks, and I was getting a drink for a woman in a wheelchair, and I just said, look, I'm getting a drink for a woman in a wheelchair, and everyone let me go to the front. You know, it was kind, do you see what I mean? It was kind of, it just became totally ridiculous the way it was played out in the end.
But I think at the same time, I don't know, I think it's, you know, you don't want to minimize the fact that these are very real oppressions as well. Exactly. And, you know, life, if you actually are a disabled lesbian, you know, lesbian mother, black lesbian mother, like life is going to be a lot more difficult for you in all kinds of ways. So I don't, you know, I don't think Sandra's chapter is in any way minimizing that, but I think it's kind of what
no, but the gutter press mocked it, picked it up and mocked it. Yeah.
And obviously now this, and I think it kind of creates a whole language around where everyone becomes very preoccupied with their own identity. It becomes very sort of navel gazing, doesn't it? And obviously now with all these, trans and genders, the sort of fake identities, we've seen that just taken to, kind of absolutely sort of absurd extremes. There's also, I thought, a really, really good, maybe it's the opening chapter, the chapter on queer politics. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that, Lynn, or
well,
again, it what's happened.
There was a book that came out called Lesbians and Queer Nations, something like that. Cherry Smith.
Lesbians Talk Queer Nations.
Lesbians Talk Queer Nations, and that it was a really good article published by Julia Carnaby on that, which talks about what that actually meant, and it was meant basically lesbians imitating gay men, calling themselves daddy dykes and lesbian boys, imitating what we've already talked about in a way, sadomasochism, and saying, as long as lesbians consent to it, it's okay, and then various aspects of the other thing, which we'll come on to later, but that also lesbians should have sex with men.
Oh yeah, that whole
that whole thing came out of queer, and basically should be bisexual. They should either have sex with men or with heterosexual men, but if they're being really radical, they should have sex with a gay man. And I think there's some incident described somewhere where a lesbian and gay man had sex in public somewhere, and how radical that was, etc. And so that was the basic theme of what Queer Straights, in her article, in Julia Carnaby's article, Queer Straights is about. And also that, there's some really horrific, in the Lesbians Talk Queer Nations, there's some really horrific statements like, Cherry Smith, it's written by Cherry Smith, and she says, I can't, celebrating objectifying other women, and all this about celebration, the objectification of other women, and being able to do that, and being able to enjoy pornography, all these aspects of what she was saying, and really so much in contrast to lesbian feminism, which was about having equality in relationships and so on, and certainly not into getting into S&M practices and all of that. So.
And that sort of material that Julia Carnaby talks about, the Cherry Smith material, there's a lot, especially in the sexuality section. And I think though some women who aren't familiar with what was going on at that time will probably, I really felt quite ill reading some of that, because it's just, it's so anti-woman, so anti-lesbian, and it was just really, becoming, as you say, very sort of mainstream within the sort of mainstream publications and media of, with the broader lesbian and gay community at that time. And some of it is just absolutely, there was one part, I think it's actually in Sheila's chapter, some of the really disturbing extracts that she quotes from some of these, like, pro-sadomasochist sort of fiction. And I just thought, for those in the audience who aren't from outside the UK, we've just had a whole series of scandals with the Metropolitan Police and the kind of things that they've been really disgustingly misogynist and racist content of some of their like WhatsApp groups and things like that. And as I was reading this, I thought, well, some of this really wouldn't be out of place there. It was just so glorifying of sexual violence. And I think the way that that gets kind of exposed for what it is just such a really important, if really kind of pretty dismal job that you've done. Elaine, maybe we can come on now to talk about, hopefully we'll come back to talk about that section 2 on sexuality, but
what about the lesbian and gay movement?
Oh, sorry, we didn't do that. Yes.
Yeah, can I just talk very briefly about that? Yes.
Yes, of course. We did. That's the, yeah, that was your chapter in it. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
We'll come to you, Elaine. Yeah. Sorry.
It's all right. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because that's your chapter, isn't it, that we didn't talk about?
Yes, I call my chapter Dangerous Liaisons, and it's really about what did in these liaisons, which were particularly becoming common at the end of the 1980s, and both against Section 28, the campaign against Section 28, and then in Stonewall and outrage and so on. And the first thing really I focused on is that, and it started with the Gay Liberation Front in 1970, that there were lesbians in there. But what did gay men actually think about lesbians, and what were lesbians' experiences of working with gay men? And really, after 2 years of lesbians in gay liberation, most of them left. And they left because, to quote Jane Dixon, because of disguised misogyny. And it was basically about the differences in sexuality. Lesbians did not want to pick up other lesbians in public toilets, and gay men did. And it was those sort of differences. There was nothing in common between gay sexuality and lesbian sexuality. And we also have a great quote from Annie Brax, which I'd just like to read to you. If I can find it, where's it gone? Ceremoniously, we went into the crammed hall, declared we'd had enough of their hypocrisy, their youth cult, their camp and their drag, parodies of female oppression, and that we felt that the women's liberation movement was where we belonged. Among moans of "Don't leave us, sisters, what will we do without you?" we walked out. I think that sums it up, really. So just and then there were accounts from Liz Stanley, from lesbians being involved in Che, and wanting to have separate women-only groups in Che, but and this was opposed by that's a campaign for homosexuality, something.
Homosexual equality.
Homosexual equality, yes. And gay men were just totally opposed to women even being in Che. And, you know, she says that women, what they say is women literally stank. They thought, gay men said women literally smelt, they literally stank, and they shouldn't be. Che was for gay men only. And there were other things that were happening that gay men were getting off. They had a gay phone line, and they were getting off with obscene phone calls coming through to lesbians. And many of them were going to these commercial clubs. They weren't challenging. I mean, right at the beginning, gay men were supposed to be challenging their masculinity and their sexual behavior. They weren't doing that at all. They were going off to gay commercial clubs. And their response to being criticized for that, and, you know, just objectifying, picking up other gay men, was that in the next, when the revolution comes, you two sisters will be able to do this. And then, well, we got the sort of the Cherry Smith, the queer revolution, where lesbians were doing that. So, I mean, just moving on, there were lesbian and gays working together at the GLC, at the Greater London Council, but there was also the Women's Committee, women working for the Women's Committee who were lesbian feminists. And the problem I just wrote about my own experience working at the GLC as a challenging heterosexism officer, and talking to, because one of my responsibilities was to get training on challenging heterosexism going, and talking to the gay men there, and there was a gay male mafia who were very dominant there. And they just said, well, you can't say that, for a start, you can't say that being lesbian or gay is socially constructed. Which was what radical lesbian feminists were saying, and a positive choice from our point of view. Lesbians were making positive choices to be lesbian. You've got to say, we can't help it, we were born that way, and we can't change our biological nature, etc., etc. So we've got to get straight society to feel sorry for us. In fact, the leaflets that I brought out, the first sentence did say that sexuality was socially constructed. I managed to get that in and passed, but it did cause a huge furore amongst gay men.
Yeah, well done. And I think, that experience of like being kind of, right in the, in the heart of things, and trying to, have those kind of, I know I'm very familiar with those kind of battles myself, of being, when you're trying to be, a bit of an insider outsider kind of thing in that role. And so anyway, in that chapter as well, I think you document like the activism around AIDS, that obviously what you're talking about now, fed into the clause 28 activism, isn't it? And those kinds of splits. And I think that gets picked up later as well in the book.
I mean, just to say briefly that lots of lesbians did get and some lesbian feminists did get involved in fighting the clause, and some fought separately, had separate groups, separate lesbian groups about the clause, and talking about lesbian mothers and their children and so on. But it did, I think, for younger lesbians working with gay men, not only supporting them around AIDS, but bringing them closer to it, did have that impact of them wanting to, seeing them as much more powerful and wanting some of that power. And then just to move on to Stonewall was created basically founded by two gay men, and two well-known gay men and one lesbian, Lisa Power, in 1989. And all that Stonewall was doing was, it ignored lesbian rights virtually totally, and
it was very assimilationist, wasn't it? It's very like gay male assimilation. We want equal marriage, we want equal,
But the biggest thing that I objected to was the legalization that they got and that they fought for, as did Outrage, this sort of queer group, was legalizing anal sex for all men, which had the implications, not just if they just stuck to gay men, then you could say okay, but it was for all men, and the implications then for all women. And so,
and we can see the consequences now.
Yeah, the consequences.
Normalization of that, and the sort of pressure and coercion, and
and then there were they were not Stonewall particularly, but it's Tatchell from the outrage group. They were supporting. They wanted to change the law. They wanted to get a change. It was called Operation Spanner, and they wanted to get the law changed so that if somebody was seriously harmed in a S&M relationship, they wouldn't be convicted of either murder.
Be seen as a kind of their individual liberty. I mean, there's so much. I'm keeping an eye on the time. Elaine, I really
there's running out.
We are running out. So I'm gonna come on to Elaine's section now, the section you're going to be talking about.
And go on.
And so your particular chapter in there, you talk about representations of lesbians in some of the sort of like the mainstream lesbian and gay or lesbian publications of the time. And can you tell us something about what the patterns of those representations were, and what your critique was of them, Elaine?
And in fact, I can't resist. I wasn't going to say this bit, but I can't resist just talking about gay men. The pink paper, I said, the agenda was set in the early years with a tedious page after page spread of male pornographic advertisements, chat lines, date lines, big boys doing it, spanking gays at it, chained and dominated, meat market, rear entry, power tool, hung like a donkey, confronted by pages of this rubbish week after week. It was hard to take it seriously. But what I actually did, I talked about, my chapter was called The Flight of the Feminist, and I talked about the way lesbians were represented in the contemporary magazines and newspapers. And I compared them with the earlier ones. Lesbians of our era will be really familiar with Wires, the London Women's Liberation newsletter, and Outright, where those magazines reflected the struggles and they debated relevant issues. So there was a real sense of community up and down the country.
Elaine, can you say, sorry, for those who don't know, can you just say what Wires, if you remember what that
Wires was run by collectives of women. It moved from town to town, so it wasn't London dominated. It was in Nottingham, it was in Manchester. It would move around, and in fact the political lesbianism debate was first in that, before Only Women Press put it together. But then the ones that were around in the era we're talking about, there was the pink paper, She Bang, Diva, Lip, and Lesbian London, and they undermined the lesbian feminist project, and they disappeared lesbians in a really vitriolic way. For instance, there were wholesale attacks on radical lesbian feminists in the guise, for instance, of surveys. Here's another quote: "I am sick to death of lesbians being portrayed as short-haired butch women. If only people saw more of the lovely femme ones who are 100% lesbian." So that kind of thing. And what I said about image, the lesbian of today, according to She Bang, Diva, and Lip, is young, scantily clad, obsessed with style and image, likes for the most part to have men around, is fun-loving, defined as dancing, clubbing, drinking, and sex, likes and happily participates in pornography, and she sleeps with men from time to time. And the other thing about the magazines, they totally ignored women's interests. There were two lesbians who were victimized, a police officer and the head of a school in Hackney, and they used headlines like "Underwear Officer suspended again. So they were no better from the tabloid press. And they ridiculed important lesbian feminist books. They ridiculed Outer Course. Now, I remember a whole group of us went to see Mary Daly talking about Outer Course, and I can remember the absolute joy, and then all wandering down the street afterwards singing, "Now says the cow." But the way this particular mag said it was so heavy, it was like a symbol of my oppression. And they similarly ridiculed Sheila's book, The Lesbian Heresy. Didn't even read it. It was a supposed review, and it really looked as though, well, they questioned her motives in writing it. So basically, what the magazines did, it exposes how lesbians were set off against other lesbians. Oh yes, there was a comedian, Donna MacPhail. She talked about fat, ugly, old lesbians being shocked at the exciting new pornography of today. This is being said to lesbians. So the whole pattern was set. And I was shocked when I look back, because I hadn't read the book for years, at how the attacks were so blatant on us. And it shows the bullying. It leads to the bullying of young lesbians now, or young women who reject femininity, how difficult it is for them. So I think those magazines really showed up. They knocked us down and then presented the lipstick lesbian, the lover of porn, and all the things in the other chapters. And just on that bit, I actually started my chapter by saying I was really pissed off because I went to Kilburn Bookshop and a gay man said, "Look, Elaine, here's a wonderful new book come in." And it was the Penguin Book of Lesbian Short Stories. And the cover showed a butch and femme, but the femme was virtually naked. She just had a little bolero. They were both naked from the waist down. And I remember being so angry and humiliated. And I remember that a few years before, we'd gone down the road in Kilburn High Street. We'd gone into the Tricycle Theatre and taken down from a whole art exhibition that was pornographic. We literally went in and physically lifted the paintings off the walls, and they didn't put it back up. I talk about that in the chapter. And a lot of women agreed with us. And it was even presented in the local press, the Wilson and Brent Chronicle and Kilburn Times, were they right to take it down. So it just showed how in a few years things had totally changed. So that was that chapter. I don't know if you want me to say any more about the other bits.
Well, I'd like to, maybe we can see how we go for time, but I'd like to ask you about, so I know from that chapter, you were then invited to edit your own collection. And I just wondered if, which was, again, as I remember, kind of looking at representation again, it was called Beyond Sex and Romance.
Beyond Sex and Romance, the politics of contemporary lesbian fiction.
There we go. Yeah, that was it. On lesbian fiction. So I don't know, would you like to just say something about that and how this chapter, because I think that was a really development. And again,
it came about
really sort of hearing that much about those kind of critiques about ideas.
It came about because but I took in that chapter Barbara Wilson as an example. She changed her storylines to reflect queer ideology. And a lot of other authors did this as well.
Can you maybe say something, Elaine? Can you just say something about Barbara Wilson's work, like that she's a writer of like lesbian crime fiction, just so that women know that.
Yeah, okay. Her early books are all portray lesbians and feminists working against pornography, working in collectives, coming out as lesbians. They weren't all lesbians to start with, and they're very good. Sisters of the Road was one. I've forgotten the name of the other one, but they show Murder in the Collective. That's right. They showed women working together, and one woman actually murdered a violent man. And 3 other women knew about it, and they didn't betray her. They just kept silent. But in her later books, she turned right away from that. She wrote an essay in a book saying, if one pushes hard enough, the boundaries change, and what was once outside is inside. If we're looking for inclusion, perhaps that's as it should be. And she said she wanted to be more frivolous, joke more, and ponder less. And the two novels I analysed in here are horrendous. The dog collar murders, where you have an anti-pornography campaigner murdered at a sexuality conference, and the women who were feminists in the early novels are going around trying to track down the murderer, and they're diverted by going into a strip club and seeing a woman dancing naked in high heels. And they say they envy gay men's sexual practices, say we never had that joy in the feminist community. And the characters opposed to pornography are presented as faceless and brainwashed, and the murdered woman is not cared about at all. So that book seemed to me to be just a symbolic murder of radical feminism. And then the last one, Gaudi Afternoon, you've got transsexuals who are central characters. And the main plot line is a lesbian mother has to go into family therapy to accept transsexuality, with which we're told she had problems, in order to share custody of her daughter with her husband, who of course now is a woman. And this is considered fun and modern and moving forward. And in my later book, in fact, a lot of women contributed to that as well. It was almost all the rage Mark II. We had a lot of contributors, and we all discussed various novels. And what's interesting, what emerged is it's really difficult to criticize the ideology of lesbian novels. I think that's a really interesting question, because a lot of novelists just turn away from feminism, like in one of the Ellen Hart novels, a woman murders a violent man and she's given life imprisonment, and this is condoned by the author. So I think it's really interesting how lesbian novels like change their tune, and maybe that's why they're not so popular now. I'm not up with recent ones. Anyway, that's
and maybe I think maybe we could do another session on that collection, Beyond Sex and Romance, because I think it does raise those kind of questions really, really interestingly. And again, I don't know, I'm not aware that there's a huge amount of discussion around those things now. So I think that would be really, really good as well. I'm conscious of time, so maybe we could just say something a bit about the that sexuality section, and in particular the bisexuality as backlash, because I think that was really, really it was awful, but really kind of significant that was happening at the time. I think we usually think of maybe these days of bisexuality in terms of sort of trends as being something that is increasingly seen as something that's kind of like a sophisticated addition to basically being heterosexual, that, you know, sophisticated women now should have some kind of lesbian experience or sort of bisexual experience in their repertoire. You know, we see quite a lot of that in mainstream media, but less so maybe of that pressure on lesbians to be bisexual or to, you know, kind of, you know, experiment with bisexuality. Obviously now we've got all the pressure of accepting men pretending to be women, but I think that what is documented in that, I can't remember who wrote it actually. Who wrote
Sue
that?
Wilkinson.
Yes, yeah. So what she documents there about that pressure on lesbians, I think, is really interesting. I don't know if you wanted either of you to say something.
Well, it carries over from that, from the Julie Carnaby article, really, in that having sex with men, it become, as lesbians, is identified as something which becomes transgressive. Even though she says what is more boring than having heterosexual sex, what, you know. So it carries over sort of from that, and we have the promotion of the bisexuality for lesbians, and just reading it, I don't know if many women have heard about Camille Paglia, still have heard about Camille Paglia, but she was the most anti-lesbian feminist lesbian, if you like, and she was promoting it, but it was also being promoted in women's magazines, popular women's magazines as well. And that's, you know, that's really something. But Camille Paglia says, I want women to be with women who are straight, who do not close themselves down to male lust. Women, I think, and she goes on to say women she thinks are naturally bisexual, etc. But that sort of attitude, yes, and the sort of magazines that were publishing it, like Vanity Fair, for example. I think it was Vanity Fair that published K.D. Lang. He was then a sort of lesbian icon and singer. Again, I don't know how popular K.D. Lang is today. She's probably even more popular, but with Cindy Crawford. But it also apparently shows her licking a dildo. K.D. Lang licking a dildo.
It was.
And
it does say something. I can't remember.
Julia Beck just said she detransitioned. She transitioned. I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. Well, she's and licking a dildo and saying that she had penis envy and penis.
Oh yes. No, licking a dish, she says here.
That's a misprint.
Licking a dish.
That's a misprint.
Is it?
Yes, it's a misprint.
It kind of would make more sense then.
It doesn't make sense. Yeah.
I know, I did wonder.
Yeah, it's a misprint.
Oh yeah, and she says I have a little bit
it.
of penis envy. I mean, yeah, certainly, you know, the kind of literature that Wilkinson quotes from, there's such glorification of the phallus, isn't there? Like that.
Yes, absolute worship of it.
And again, I just think so many of the chapters kind of pick up on the same type of material and really sort of hold it up to the light as just being so really anti-lesbian.
And Julia, you said when we were discussing this session earlier, you said the way it kind of again disappeared lesbians, you know, we're supposed to become heterosexual, and of course heterosexual women are meant to just use lesbians. And I always get puzzled when we sort of nowadays talk about LGB and leave out the T, because I think, as you know, we all very much say L, leave out the GBT. And I always, because coming on to the very last section, Lynne, where you interviewed young women, all the young women who said they were lesbian feminists, they sort of made sense to them when they started thinking they were for all women. They were working with all women, and it just seems to be a total contradiction to go back to talking about working with gay men, because we all say we see our lesbian feminism as we used to say identity. It's dangerous to use the word identity now, but we saw it very much as a political movement, and still do. And I think that's why people get puzzled when I mean, I don't know, there's been a very recent, I mean, this thing also about in that same chapter, bisexuality chapter, is also these magazines like Vanity Fair and so on were promoting weekend lesbian, being a weekend lesbian for heterosexual women, and they could be a lesbian at the weekend and then go back to their gay man. And I think this is I think this is idea, because very recently there was an article by a younger lesbian feminist about how lesbian feminism meant lesbians forcing themselves, heterosexual women forcing themselves to becoming lesbians, and not being really attracted to them and so on. And that was literally never the case at all. You know, that's rubbish. And that lesbian feminism was asexual, again, that was rubbish. You know, but that still all exists, as came out of this article, that's what young, you know, even if they call themselves lesbian
feminist lesbians now, that's what they believed. And the other thing that became really embedded is that, you know, that in contrast, they're born that way. You're only a lesbian if you're born that way from the age of 3, and you recognize that from age of 3. And even if you you become a lesbian, you have 2 or 3 heterosexual relationships and then discover you're a lesbian, and say you're discovering you're a lesbian, you're told by the hierarchy again, you still have to call yourself bisexual, because the pure lesbian is the one who's never had a heterosexual relationship.
And of course,
and can I just say one more thing? Can I just say one more thing about whether we were asexual? I just think of Tyneside Rape Crisis Centre. We all sort of set it up, and 3/4 of us immediately paired off with other women in the collective, you know, so I mean, it's so ridiculous to say we were not sexual anyway.
Yeah, it's very striking how these kind of myths get constructed. You know, and obviously when you have the experience of being there and in that environment and you're kind of really part of that change, that's something that, I think it's it's amazing really how these myths just kind of get constructed and keep coming up in different forms. And obviously that whole born that way thing has really come back with a vengeance, hasn't it? Over quite a few years now. I'm aware of time. One of the things I just really want to say in terms of the fact that it's being republished, is it being republished as an ebook? Or also...
It has been republished as ebook. It's republished at the end of November.
Yep.
So women can get it now.
Yep, by Spinifex Press. So if women go to the Spinifex website, they'll find it. I mean, one of the things is I was rereading some of these chapters and reading some for the first time. I think it does such a great job of really showing the roots or the kind of germ of what we're seeing now in terms of the backlash, which has obviously just become far even more kind of vicious and more overt. But it really kind of seems, well, it's no surprise really, because we could see what was happening there that you were trying to document. What are your kind of feelings? I guess you're both really pleased it's being republished. What are your hopes of what it can contribute, and what role do you think the book has to play now in this current context?
Well,
maybe Elaine could say, because I think
thank you. Because I think it reveals that transgenderism didn't come out of nowhere. This battle's been going on. It also reveals how lesbians have been set against each other by men. And hopefully that will help our strategies for the future, and it gives us ammunition to keep fighting, because it also I think the other thing it does, I often say I'm speaking whenever I go to meetings. I say, going back to identity politics, I say I'm speaking as a radical lesbian feminist, and often people are quite bemused and they don't really know what you mean. And if they read this book, they will know exactly what you mean. Because I think a lot of people, heterosexual women perhaps, that we work with don't realize that we see lesbianism as a political movement. You know, it's not about just who you sleep with. It's about doing what we can for all women and liberating women. That's what the women's liberation movement is. So thanks, my
Elaine.
view on it.
Thanks, Elaine. And Lynn, maybe final.
Just at the time it came out, it did get a good reception. I went on Women's Hour against Angela Mason.
Who was the head of Stonewall, wasn't she?
The head of Stonewall, and she just couldn't, I was just talking about how Stonewall had done absolutely nothing for lesbians, and there was a lesbian head teacher who was getting attacked at the time for challenging heterosexism, and they refused to support her, and it was all about gay men's rights. But now I think it does set the background of, for the development of transgenderism, but that was coming in as well. I mean, Rosemary Outmooty's article on lesbian studies, even in the 1990s, lecturers were expected to talk about transgenderism in lesbian studies, you know, so that was already creeping in at that point in the mid 1990s when, but just, and yeah, I mean, I think that it does, I mean, I know that women who've read it came across it fairly recently, you know, in the last few years have found it really illuminating. So I would say, you know, if women haven't read it, I do think it's very illuminating about where we are now, really.
Yeah.
It's also inspiring that there's lots of women, you know, there are 15 contributors, and I hadn't read, the other thing to point out, we all hadn't read the other chapters of the other women, only the editors had done that. And I was struck by how we were all singing from the same hymn sheet. You know, we had unanimity about how we felt. And I think that sort of hopefully would inspire women now.
Yeah, I think that's a great note on which to end. I would just add as well, the quality of the analysis. I just think it's like a glass of water in the desert, you know, because I think particularly for a new generation of women who are, you know, lesbians who are struggling with the situation that we have now, I just think the way in which, you know, the analysis kind of cuts through and sees so clearly what's going on, I think it's fantastic. And I really hope that a whole new generation of women will discover and read this book. So okay, so I think it's about time. So thank you so much, Lynne and Elaine.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.